Hey, this is Doug Hamp. I'm over at scientificamerican.com and they're discussing the origins of directed panspermia. Now, directed panspermia is a big fancy word for basically the idea that aliens dropped off DNA. You know who was the first person to come up with this? Well, a guy named Francis Crick. Well, what makes him so special? Well, he was one of the co-discoverers of DNA. And here's the guy that got a Nobel Peace Prize or Nobel Prize in Science for discovering DNA, and yet he thought that the way that got here is because aliens dropped it off. Now that should be a real clue to us that here a pretty smart guy who had a pretty amazing discovery thought the origin of DNA had to come from some kind of intelligent source. That's really huge. And yet, as we go through this article, we're going to see that they're going to resist that. They don't really want to come to the conclusion that maybe, just maybe, God or some great, amazing being, just like God, might have done it. They'd rather deflect that and say, well, it must have been the aliens because we know there's no God, so it had to be aliens. But all you do is you push it back one step. You see, if you say that the aliens brought it, well, who started the aliens' civilization? Where did their DNA come from? Well, it's aliens all the way back. I mean, that's the kind of idea, this infinite regression. You can't do it. At some point, you got to stop and say there must have been some amazingly powerful, almighty God, or some whatever you want to call him, almighty, the big guy in the sky, the grand dude that stops and does it all. You've got to stop and start with somebody. So they have in this article, The Origins of Directed Panspermia, the Earth is beaming with life, and yet there is no consensus on how life arose or what life is. Well, that's not true. The Bible tells us God created it, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then he created light, and he separated the light from the darkness, and then he created the dry land, and he separated the waters from the dry land, and then he created the vegetation, and then he created the sun and moon and stars, and then he created all the life that's in the waters and the birds of the air, and then he created the creepy crawlies and all the animals on the ground, and then he created man, and now we know what life is because God himself created it. God is the one who got this all started. We don't have to scratch our heads and say, gosh, where did all this come from? Was it aliens maybe, like Francis Crick suggested? You see, you can be really smart and be awesome in some areas and yet lack some basic wisdom. And this is one of those unfortunate areas that some very intelligent people who've done some incredible things in life, and yet when it comes to the obvious that should be smacking them in the face, somehow it just doesn't get there. They just can't quite see it. So the origin of life is one of the great unsolved mysteries of science. Again, according to these guys, Francis Crick, he writes in Life Itself. While there is no accepted definition of life, most of us humans can easily determine the living from the non-living. It's really simple. If something is moving, not just going back and forth in the breeze, but if it has well, if I say life, if it has some kind of movement, there's some kind of fluctuation. It's really basic. When you get down to the cellular level, if a cell is moving, if it has movement inside of it, it's alive. If it doesn't have movement, it's dead. That's really the basic idea. God is the one who set that movement in place. Now, there's really basic kinds of life. I mean, are trees alive? Yeah, they are. Are plants alive? Sure, of course they are. But they're not conscious. They don't have a brain like we do. They're not able to think thoughts, or they're not even like a dog. They can't, determine what they're going to do and where they're going to go. They don't think like dogs or like people, but they still have life because there's movement, there's growth, there's something that's building, and God is the one who created that. So he says that Irish Fry's book is a good primer on ideas regarding the origins of life. I think the Bible is a great place to start. I think that's a really good primer on the origins of life. Well, questions about the origin of life became more prevalent after Pasteur and others showed that life did not arise spontaneously. Now, it's interesting. What people thought was that, you might leave some rags in the corner and then poof, these mice would just come out of it because, there were no mice there to begin with, and then suddenly mice would come out of it. or they would leave some old food in, some place, and then, oh my goodness, these maggots would start coming out of it. And it seemed like you had spontaneous generation of life. That was the prevalent idea for a long time. And then Louis Pasteur showed that no, when something is in a sterile environment, life doesn't just come because there's no bacteria. They don't have an opportunity to, bacteria and other things to lay eggs and then those grow, etc. So there's no opportunity for that when you have a sterile environment and a controlled environment as well. Well, the article goes on to say the discovery that the raw components of life are present throughout the universe suggests that life could exist elsewhere, and that the origin of life, as we know it, may have depended on materials that arrived on Earth via interstellar travel. Okay, right. Some scientists have speculated that life itself originated elsewhere and made its way to Earth. Well, again, all you have is just the infinite regression problem. You haven't solved the origin of life. You've just pushed the origin back one step and said, well, we don't want to deal with it. Let's just imagine that our big brothers in the sky, the aliens or whoever they were, they somehow dropped it off, or it hitched a ride on the back of a comet or something like that. Again, it doesn't make any sense. In the 2012 movie called Prometheus was released. In this stunning movie, human scholars find similarities between archaeological sites from ancient civilizations separated by centuries have drawn the same pictogram. The archaeologists conclude that the pictogram must be a map, an invitation from the engineers who not only designed us but have intervened in our affairs. The movie is set in 2093, and researchers decide to go and find them in a quest to further understand the origins of mankind. Despite its several and severe scientific flaws, Prometheus is an interesting film because it addresses that ever mysterious quest to unveil not only how we came to be, but how life began. Well, it's fiction, guys. And in the movie, at the very beginning of the movie, you have this weird-looking alien guy. He's kind of gray and doesn't have a smile on his face. Somehow he takes some weird concoction, and it kind of like kills him and reduces him to just down to his DNA. That he falls into this stream, and then the stream pushes it throughout the world. And then, of course, we get this impression that, well, life arose because DNA was dropped off by the aliens, and that's how life got started here. That's just a bunch of nonsense, of course. And yet, this is what people are actually taking somewhat seriously. Again, Francis Crick, he won the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA. At least he's the first guy, and he and his partner, Francis and Crick, excuse me. But so these guys are getting the glory for discovering DNA, and then they can't decide, how did this get started? Now, what's the problem here? What's the big deal about DNA? Well, DNA is a code. It has information. And what we've discovered is that information doesn't just happen all by itself. Now, you're maybe watching this on a TV or on a computer. Let's say it's a computer. And maybe you're using the Mac or using Windows, or maybe it's on Google or something. Each of these companies have thousands and thousands of people that work for them. And it took millions and millions of man hours to create the software and the hardware that you're using right now to watch this program. It didn't just happen. It took intelligent people. And you may not think they're so intelligent if you don't like the current operating system. Maybe you don't like the Windows guys. They're a bunch of dummies. Well, they're still pretty smart. Maybe you don't like the Mac people. They're still pretty smart. And they had to spend a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of brain power to make it all happen. It didn't just evolve. Now, sometimes we talk about the evolution of the computer. I mean, think about it. I think about computers way back when they were barely computers. And now they're pretty amazing. The computer has evolved. I mean, oh my. But it didn't just happen by itself. We didn't just leave the computer on a shelf somewhere and come back in 20 years and, oh my goodness, this computer, look what it's done. It's really evolved. It didn't happen that way. It took real people to design and develop the next phase of that computer, the hardware, and the software. And when we look inside of DNA, what do we find? We find an incredibly sophisticated information system. And it's not base 2, it's base 4. It's so incredible. Who put the information in there in the first place? Well, it came from our parents. Well, that's just a copy of a copy. That's like you copying something onto your flash drive, or sending an attachment in your email. That's all you're doing. You're just copying the program, and you're then sharing it with somebody else. And you're making a copy of a copy and then a copy of a copy. That's what children are. So where did that code come from in the first place? Where did the original program or app come from in the first place? It didn't just happen. It had to come from an intelligent source, and we understand that intelligent source to be God. You can call him by another name, source. Some people want to say the universe, whatever. But it's a really intelligent being, a sentient being who cares, who thinks, who's an incredible engineer. I think a good term for him is God. It kind of it's a nice all-around term that gets us into that basic place. Well, life in space, they go on to say, has been making the news, and on November 20th, 2012, NPR reported that NASA's Mars Curiosity rover had gathered important data. Mars holds a special place in our world. The principal Mars rover investigator, John Grotzinger, claimed this data is going to be one for the history books. It's looking really good. He refused to give any more details because his team had to confirm their findings. In general, this is good practice because scientists want to avoid finding superfluous results and correlations. However, in this case, it heightened suspicion. What did they find? Shortly thereafter, NASA tried to downplay Grotzinger's statements, pointing out that it was the mission which was historic rather than a specific finding. Despite this backtracking, some speculated that organic compounds had been found. Some claimed that it was life that had been discovered. On December 3rd, NASA confirmed Curiosity had found organic compounds, but it was uncertain whether they were indigenous to Mars or had been brought by Curiosity. Now that's interesting. All right, most of the speculation had suggested that organic compounds were the historical finding. These are also important because they confirm that the stuff of life, the raw materials, are far more common than originally thought, as corroborated by the discovery of signs of water and organic molecules in mercury, or the finding of organic molecules in meteorites. Like the discovery of extremophiles, which show that once life got started, it could be found in unsuspected places or unexpected places, the advances in the search for extraterrestrial life suggest that the stuff of life, and hence life, could be commonly found throughout the universe. Well, that's all nice. They haven't given us any evidence of how that life got started. It takes intelligence to start life. Because at the core, the source of life, we have this thing called DNA. DNA is code. It's really amazing code. It's more amazing than your computer. It's more amazing than your smartphone. It's more amazing than anything that we've actually created. In fact, it's so amazing, we're trying to copy it. Because we're like, wow, this is really cool code. Let's check this out and see what it does. And we're trying to dice and splice and see what we can do. Because it's such amazing code. And we're just now barely beginning to scratch the surface of what is actually inside that DNA. For years they thought that much of our DNA was just junk. Because over the years, over the millions of years of evolution, we have all this extra DNA that's not good for anything. It's just junk. And so it's still in our bodies, but we don't need it. Well, now they've discovered that, oh my goodness, we were so stupid. It actually is good for something. We just didn't know what it was for. See, that's part of the hubris that sometimes we have, that we assume that, well, we don't need God. We don't need a creator. We can start ourselves, just spontaneous generation or directed panspermia, right? That aliens dropped it off. But again, who dropped off the aliens' DNA? Well, Francis Crick, who co-discovered the structure of DNA with James Watson, and Leslie Orgel, once proposed that life on Earth was the result of a deliberate infection designed by aliens who had purposely fled Mother Nature's seed to a new home in the sun. Crick repeatedly addressed the question of the origin of life between 1971 and 1988, and the author is currently working on a historical study of Crick and Orgel's theory of directed panspermia and its reception. Again, this isn't some fly-by-night scientist or some guy who's working in the back office somewhere and nobody wants to listen to. This is Francis Crick. He's a really smart guy. And yet, he thinks it was aliens who dropped off DNA to planet Earth. I think it was God who dropped off the DNA. I think it was God who took the dust and he formed man, and he's the one who put the DNA in there, and then he breathed into Adam, and he became a living spirit. God created that. What's so tough to believe about that? That this really intelligent being, known as the creator of everything, heaven and earth, he actually made life. Why is that so hard for people to understand? My theory is that if there's a creator, then we just might be accountable to that creator. We might have to answer for our actions. Oh no. We might have to take responsibility for the things that we did. Oh no. It's much easier to believe that some aliens who hate us, who don't care about us, just like in the movie Prometheus, that when they actually finally meet this long lost creator, the creator hates them. It doesn't. Why did you come to visit me? He sort of says as he's, killing them. Obviously they're just an experiment. We don't care about you. Whereas the God of the Bible, the creator, the source of this universe, he loves us. He cares about us. Here's the cool thing. He made us in his image and in his likeness. Isn't that cool? It's pretty amazing. So rather than try to run away from our creator, we should embrace our creator and say, wow, this DNA that's inside of me, who put that there? My creator put that there. He made me like him. There's some really astounding passages in Scripture. One says that it's whoever has come to God, it's impossible to continue to sin because he has God's DNA. Well, it says seed, but the word seed, sperma, what's inside of sperm or DNA? DNA is inside of a seed. That's what you have. So Crick and Orgel proposed that directed panspermia theory at a conference on communication with extraterrestrial intelligence organized by Carl Sagan. Now Sagan's another interesting guy. Here's Carl Sagan, just a flaming atheist and evolutionist, didn't believe in God. He's of course dead now. I think he knows the truth. But he wrote a book called Contact, and in his book Contact, what does he do? How does he have life begin? Same thing. It's directed panspermia, that it was the aliens who dropped it off. And throughout the book, the main character, she goes and sort of discovers these creators, but they say, oh, we're not the creators. There was this whole system of transportation and all this cool information in the universe long before we got here. And she's like, well, where did it all come from? Well, there were some of these other aliens way before us. And so again, they never solve it. Carl Sagan, he's creating his own universe. He's got the opportunity to tell us how it got started. But no, he just pushes it back and pushes it back because that's all they can do. That it wasn't God, but it was just aliens, right? And they're okay with that, but they're not okay with an actual God, with the God, with the creator who creates it. So this theory, which they held as an highly unorthodox proposal and bold speculation, was presented as a plausible scientific hypothesis. 2 years after the conference, they published an article in Icarus in 1973. Crick and Orgel were careful to point out that directed panspermia was not a certainty, but rather a plausible alternative that ought to be taken seriously. In the paper, Crick and Orgel recognize that they do not have any strong arguments of this kind, but there are two weak facts that could be relevant. The 1973 paper focuses on the universality of the genetic code and the role that molybdenum plays in living organisms. The author is also working on a history of molybdenum and the origins of life, which is more than one expected given the abundance of molybdenum in the Earth's crust. Crick and Orgel use the universality of the genetic code to support the theory of directed panspermia, because if life had originated multiple times or evolved from a simpler genetic code, one could expect living things to use a slew of genetic codes. Further, if there was only one code, Crick and Orgel reasoned that as organisms evolved, they should evolve to use the same codons to code for different amino acids. Again, where does this code come from? Does it just happen spontaneously by itself? Well, again, Louis Pasteur proved that no, things do not spontaneously generate. So even if we say it was aliens, where do the aliens get their DNA from? We're left with the same problem. Was it aliens all the way back? Kind of like, if the flat earth is on top of a turtle, well, what's underneath the turtle? Well, it's turtles all the way down. You see, it just doesn't work. You've got to have an origin at some point. Well, we can draw a parallel, the author says, to language. While many human populations use the same symbols or letters, they combine them in different ways. These different languages use the same alphabets, but different combinations of the same symbols to denote different objects. French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Catalan, as opposed to different codes, languages which uses different alphabets like Spanish and Mandarin. However, what we find is an analog to a single universal language. Their most convincing argument was the importance of molybdenum in organic processes and its relative scarcity on Earth. They had argued that living organisms should bear the stamp of the environment in which they originated. Organisms, Crick and Orgel held, would be unlikely to develop a dependency on elements that were extremely rare, as organisms that relied on elements which were more abundant would be favored by selection. And organisms that was able to substitute the rare element for one that has similar biochemical properties but is more frequent would have a clear advantage. Crick and Orgel pointed out the anomalous abundance of molybdenum in organisms made it possible that life arose in an environment rich in molybdenum. The abundance of molybdenum in living organisms suggested that life started in a molybdenum-rich environment, and that they found that the Earth is not sufficiently rich in molybdenum, which was later challenged as the amount of molybdenum found in the ocean is higher than in the Earth's crust. Well, there it is. Thus, they suggest that this difficulty could be resolved if life began in a molybdenum-rich environment. Likewise, the fact that all the organisms use the same codons for the same amino acids could be explained if life had arisen elsewhere, and that organisms which were used to infect lifeless planets shared a language. I think maybe God just used the same language for life in general. You know, the DNA is a really cool code, and it can go in this direction, go in this direction. You can use the same code to write different programs as different creatures. What's the problem with that? Oh no, we can't say God. I mean, no, that would be really terrible. You know, God is the one who created it. It's not so hard to believe. It makes great sense. Scientifically, it's the best answer. Scientifically, it's the only answer. There is no other explanation for where life came from. Now listen, I'll give biologists and chemists a lot of credit when it comes to how does a cell work. Well, they can tell me that, and they're experts at that. And they can say, look, here's all the different parts of it. Here's a cytoplasm, and here's inside the nucleus, and all these really cool things, and the organelles inside the molecule. I'm impressed, right? I'm really impressed when you show me what is inside of that cell. It's pretty awesome. But the question of, well, how did this and all the cells get started, like from the beginning? They have no scientific explanation for that, because science relies on observation and repeatability. You have to test it. And origins are not something that you can test. They're not something that you can go back and say, well, we have this evidence and we can test it and we were there to observe it. Nobody was there. Only God. And God thankfully left us a written testimony of what he did. Well, Crick and Orgel also suggest that the universe is sufficiently old that other intelligent civilizations could have arisen elsewhere. One of these other intelligent civilizations could have built a spaceship and seeded the universe with life. One can easily imagine a not too distant future where humans accept that our planet and all that lives within it will perish, and that the unlikelihood that this is the only planet that harbors life in the universe, its demise would leave a lifeless universe. The demise of our kind is hard enough to accept, but the prospect of a lifeless universe, a universe that could never come to know itself, a universe so grand and yet with no one to admire it or even dwell in it, could be too much to bear. Oh no, we have to save the universe. In order to save our kind, we can envision our zealous and hardworking descendants endeavoring to colonize other worlds by sending microbes through interstellar journeys. Microorganisms are easier to transport and could more readily adapt to new conditions. Sending larger organisms would be too difficult, Crick and Orgel pointed out. I mean, this is just absolute. Why is the Bible less credible than this kind of stuff? Why is saying that, well, we can imagine that maybe somewhere, some way, somehow, aliens a long, long, long time ago seeded the universe? Really? That's more scientific than saying in the beginning, God, the creator, this incredibly super intelligent being, created a being in his own image and his likeness, and he made all these other animals too. Is that really so hard to believe? I don't think so. The origins of life remains an unresolved mystery. No, it is not unresolved. Only if you are willfully ignorant of what the Bible says. If you don't want to open your eyes and say, you know what, there has to be a God. Now, you may not like the God. Your understanding of God may be different than mine. But at the base, the basic place that we should get to is that we should both agree that there has to be a super intelligent creator who created the universe, and he created DNA. It wasn't made by aliens because, again, was it aliens all the way back? You know, who seeded the life for those aliens, and who seeded the life for those other aliens? It doesn't resolve the problem, even if we have directed panspermia. So, kind of a funny argument from such an intelligent person. The author says, I argue that Crick and Orgel's paper was meant both as a serious and plausible scientific alternative and as a means to criticize concurrent origins of life. Considering that life arose elsewhere could also free scientists studying the origin of life from trying to imitate the alleged conditions of a prebiotic Earth. My ongoing research suggests that while Orgel abandoned directed panspermia, Crick continued to advocate for its viability and to argue in its favor. Our continued exploration of space will presumably continue to reveal the existence of organic compounds in space and quite possibly life, and hence suggest that the universe may be beaming with life. Well, at the bottom line, God made it. It's not that hard to understand. I appreciate the work that biologists and chemists and geneticists, etc., are doing. They're helping us understand how life works. They're helping us understand what is inside of a cell. They're helping us understand all kinds of cool things about life. But when it comes to the origin of life, they haven't a clue. And the Bible tells us very specifically, God did it. Okay, God did it. It's super easy to understand. It's not complicated. Now, how it all works, that's really cool stuff. And I appreciate the work of these scholars. But on the question of where did it come from? Was it aliens that got it started? No, that's ridiculous. God is the one who got it all started. Thankfully, God left us a record and he told us, I'm the one that got it started. Thank you very much. Hey, if you like this video, go ahead and subscribe. Make sure to click on that little button there, that bell, and that will allow you to be notified when I have more things coming out. Appreciate you watching. God bless you guys. Stay in the Word, everybody. God made the world. He made life. And there is no unresolved mystery of where life came from. God did it. Take care.